bane at Munda. Plutarch tells us, the Romans gave way before his good fortune and accepted the bit, like a horse, the bit in the mouth, i.e. to be dominated or to have a master. Plutarch says the Romans accepted the bit. The rule of one man would give them, they thought, a respite from the miseries of civil wars, and so they appointed him dictator for life. This meant an undisguised tyranny. His power was now not only absolute, but perpetual. Dan Carlin talks about that, how was that just Caesar's personal ambition, that he wanted to be not only the preeminent man in Rome, but the preeminent man in Rome for the rest of his natural life? Whether that was just, Caesar's personal ambition, or whether that was just prudent, whether that was what was needed. He uses an analogy, Dan Carlin this is, of helping a little kid learn how to ride a bike without stabilizers, that the parent, the adult, holds on to the seat while the kid starts to pedal, and you let go of the seat at some point and the kid has to go on their own. That's like the Republic, the faltering, dying Republic, that Sulla let go of the bike seat right away, almost directly right away. And, well, the Republic fell off the bike almost immediately upon Sulla's death. The system he had set up crumbled and fell apart in various ways. And that Caesar saw this, realised this, recognised it, and thought that he's going to have to hold on to the bike seat for longer. The problems inherent in the late Republic were very, very deep, and it's no good to sort of just set things right on paper and then let go. The Republic needed a guiding hand for a while, years and years, perhaps half a generation or a decade or more, whatever it took. And perhaps that's Caesar's calculation, not merely that he just couldn't handle or refused to share power with anyone else. Maybe it was what Caesar calculated was the right thing to do, or the only thing to do. Who knows? You guys can make up your own mind on that. Well, Caesar doesn't last all that long in power, does he? We know this. Plutarch continues. Cicero made the first proposals in the Senate for conferring honours on him, and great as they were, it could be maintained that they were not after all too great. It could be maintained that they were not after all too great for a man, but others, in a kind of spirit of competition among themselves, proposed the most extravagant additions, with the result that they made Caesar unpopular and hateful to even the least politically minded among the citizens, because of the quite extraordinary pretentiousness of the titles decreed for him. His enemies were thought to have joined with his flatterers in getting these measures passed. They wanted to have every possible pretext to act against him, and to appear to have good reasons on their side when they came to make an attempt upon his life. A little bit of foreshadowing there by Plutarch. And certainly, in other ways, once the civil wars were over, no one could charge him with doing anything amiss. Indeed, it is thought perfectly right that the Temple of Clemency was dedicated as a thanks offering for his humane conduct after his victory. He not only pardoned many of those who had fought against him, but gave to some of them honours and offices besides, to Brutus, for instance, and to Cassius, both of whom were now praetors. Pompey's statues, too, had been thrown down, but Caesar would not tolerate this, and had them put up again. It was on this occasion that Cicero said to Caesar, in setting up Pompey's statues, had firmly fixed and established his own. And when Caesar's friends advised him to have a bodyguard, many of them volunteered to serve in it themselves. Caesar refused to have anything to do with it. It was better, he said, to die once than always be in fear of death. To surround himself with people's goodwill was, he thought, the best and truest security. And so he again sought the favour of the people by giving them feasts and allowances of grain, and gratified his soldiers by founding new colonies, the most important of which were at Carthage and at Corinth. It so happened that these two cities had, in earlier days, both been captured at the same time, nearly the same time, and now they were both restored at the same time. So, as I mentioned there, the rule of a dictator or a tyrant or an autocrat or a king or an emperor is more or less tolerable, depending on how bad, how evil or bloodthirsty that tyrant is. And Caesar, once again, in the scheme of things, is pretty benign, really. He's no Sulla. It seems to me, I think most people would agree, even Caesar's detractors, or not all of them, but most people look at Caesar's time as autocrat, and they will accept that he's no bloodthirsty butcher of men. I mean, I personally, just personal opinion alert, I would go so far as to say I feel like he's trying his hardest not to be. Right? It seems to me he's going out of his way. He's spending political capital on very proactively not being that. There you go. Caesar has got his hardline detractors, people that say the only reason he wasn't acting like a Sulla was because he didn't think he would get away with it. That's the only reason. I don't really buy that, but there's an argument to be made, fairly strong argument if you wanted to. Some of his strongest detractors say he's as power hungry, as power crazed. He's as much of a megalomaniac as any megalomaniac. He's in the mold of Alexander in that way, right? That it's never enough, is an end in and of itself. Complete power is an end in and of itself. And that had he lived longer, he would have just accrued more and more power in his own person, a bit like Augustus goes on to do. And that Caesar and the way he exercised his power have got very little, or if any, redeeming features. Once again, I wouldn't go that far, but there is an argument to be made there. Okay, Plutarch goes on. He dealt with the ruling class by promising praetorships and consulships in the future to some of them, and by winning over others with various offices and honours. All were encouraged to hope for his favour, since his great desire was to rule over subjects who accepted his rule. Thus, when the consul Maximus died, Caesar made Canonianus Rebilius consul for the one day that remained of the term of office. Many people, it appears, went to the new consul to congratulate him and to escort him down to the forum. And this was when Cicero remarked, "We'd better hurry, or he will be out of office before we get there." Caesar was born to do great things and to seek constantly for distinction. His many successes, so far from encouraging him to rest and to enjoy the fruits of all his labours, only served to kindle in him fresh confidence for the future, filling his mind with projects of still greater actions and with a passion for new glory, as though he had run through his stock of the old. His feelings can best be described by saying that he was competing with himself, as though he was someone else, and he was struggling to make the future excel the past. He had made his plans and preparations for an expedition against the Parthians. After conquering them, he proposed to march round the Black Sea by way of Hyrcania, the Caspian Sea, and the Caucasus. He would then invade Scythia, a land of unknown proportions in those days, would overrun all the countries bordering on Germany and Germany itself, and would then return to Italy by way of Gaul, thus completing the circuit of his empire, and would be bounded on all sides by the ocean. So, once again, sort of Alexander levels of ambition. While this expedition was going on, he proposed to dig a canal through the Isthmus of Corinth, and had already put Annienus in charge of this undertaking. He also planned to divert the Tiber just below the city into a deep channel, which would bend round towards Sassinum and come out into the sea at Turracina, so that there would be a safe and easy passage for merchantmen to Rome. Then too he proposed to drain the marshes by Pomentium and Setia, and to create a plain which would be cultivated by many thousands of men. He also intended to build great breakwaters along the coast, where the sea is nearest to Rome, to clear away all the obstructions which were a danger to shipping at Ostia, and to construct harbours and roadsteads big enough for the great fleets which would lie at anchor there. All these were projects for the future. His reform of the calendar, however, and the corrections made in the irregularity of reckoning time were not only studied by him with the greatest scientific skill, but were brought into effect and proved extremely useful. Indeed, the calendar we use now is still a variant of the Julian calendar. The calendar we use right now is the Gregorian calendar, which is very, very similar, a few tweaks away from the Julian calendar. And even those tweaks were only made a few hundred years ago. In very ancient times, there had been great confusion among the Romans with regard to the relation of the lunar and to the solar year, with the result that festivals and days of sacrifice gradually got out of place and finally came to be celebrated at the very opposite seasons to what was originally intended. Nor was the confusion confined to the remote past. Even at this time, most people were completely ignorant of these subjects. Only the priests knew the proper time, and they, without giving any notice, would suddenly insert in the calendar the intercalary month known as Mercadonia. It is said, so the calendar is all out of whack. It needed reform. It is said that this month was first put in by King Numa, so hundreds of years before Caesar, who thus managed to find an unsatisfactory and short-lived remedy for the error in the adjustment of the sidereal and solar cycles. I have dealt with this subject in my Life of Numa. Caesar, however, put the problem before the best scholars and mathematicians of the day, and, out of the various methods of correction already in use, he formed a new method of his own, which was more accurate than any of them. It is the one still used by the Romans, and it seems that they, better than all other people, had avoided the errors arising from the inequality between the lunar and solar years. Yet even this gave offence to those who looked at Caesar with envious eyes and resented his power. Certainly Cicero, the orator, when someone remarked that the constellation Lyra would rise next day, remarked, "No doubt by order," implying that even the rising, sarcastically, implying that even the risings of the stars were something that people had to accept under compulsion. But what made Caesar most openly and mortally hated was his passion to be made king. It was this which made the common people hate him for the first time, and it served as a most useful pretext for those others who had long hated him, but had up till now disguised their feelings. Yet those who were trying to get this honour conferred on Caesar actually spread the story among the people that it was foretold in the Sibylline books that Parthia could only be conquered by the Romans if the Roman army were to be led by a king. And as Caesar was coming down from Alba to Rome, they ventured to salute him as king, which caused a disturbance among the people. Caesar, upset by this himself, said that his name was not king but Caesar. These words were received in total silence, and he went on his way, looking far from pleased. He may have narrowly avoided full civil unrest there. Who knows? You can read between the lines for yourself again. Then there was an occasion when a number of extravagant honours had been voted for him in the Senate, and Caesar happened to be sitting above the rostra. Here he was approached by the consuls and the praetors, with the whole Senate following behind. But instead of rising to receive them, he behaved to them as though they were merely private individuals, and, after receiving their message, told them that his honours ought to be cut down rather than increased. This conduct of his offended not only the Senate, but the people as well, who felt that his treatment of the senators was an insult to the whole state. It is surprising how small, relatively or seemingly small things like that are taken very, very seriously in the English Civil War. It's just sprung to mind. Small breaks in etiquette, like not taking your hat off, might be taken the wrong way by someone or other, and it sparks off an argument, which then turns into a brawl, which then turns into snowballs into greater and greater conflict. So what at first might seem a small error of protocol or etiquette is actually the kernel of an extremely serious thing. There was a general air of the deepest dejection, and everyone who was in a position to do so went away at once. Caesar himself realized what he had done and immediately turned to go home. He drew back his toga and, uncovering his throat, cried out in a loud voice to his friends that he was ready to receive the blow from anyone who liked to give it to him. Later, however, he excused his behaviour on account of his illness, saying that those who suffer from it are apt to lose control of their senses if they address a large crowd while standing. In these circumstances, they are very subject to fits of giddiness and may fall into convulsions and insensibility. This excuse, however, was not true. Caesar himself was perfectly willing to rise and receive the Senate. But, so they say, one of his friends, or rather his flatterers, Cornelius Balbus, restrained him from doing so. "Remember," he said, "that you are Caesar, you are their superior, and ought to let them treat you as such." Quite haughty. But as you can see there, Caesar has to balance or manage both his sycophants and his enemies. It's a political tightrope he is walking, to be fair. Another thing which caused offence was his insulting treatment of the tribunes. The feast of the Lupercalia was being celebrated, and at this time many of the magistrates and many young men of noble families ran through the city naked, and in their jesting and merrymaking strike those whom they meet with shaggy thongs. I have got a bit of content actually talking about the Saturnalia, and in that I talk a bit about the Lupercalia as well. It's a very odd, to the modern mind, the whole thing's a very odd festival, but there you go. The past is a foreign land. They do things differently there. And many women of high rank purposely stand in their way and hold out their hands to be struck, like children at school. The Lupercalia is bound up with fertility and madness and all kinds of odd things. They believe that the effect will be to give an easy delivery to those who are pregnant and to help the barren to become pregnant. According to many writers, this was in ancient times a shepherd's festival and has also some connection with the Arcadian Lycaea. Caesar, sitting on a golden throne above the rostra and wearing a triumphal robe, was watching this ceremony, and Antony, who was consul at the time, was one of those taking part in the sacred running. As I say, fairly normal for a young virile man to take part in this sort of naked frivolity, but for a consul to do it, a bit odd, a bit out of the ordinary. But that's Antony for you. Perhaps it's a bit like the Prince of Wales or the Prime Minister taking part in Wipeout. There's nothing wrong with it. It's not illegal, but it's just not really done. It would seem out of place and odd. Anyway, there you go. Although having said that, a few years back, some of the royal family did take part in It's a Knockout. And public opinion didn't really like that. Sort of beneath their dignity. When he came running into the forum, Antony this is, the crowd made way for him. He was carrying a diadem with a wreath of laurel tied around it, and he held this out to Caesar. His actions were followed by some applause, but it was not much, and it was not spontaneous. But when Caesar pushed the diadem away from him, there was a general shout of applause. Many have said maybe this whole thing is contrived. Antony and/or Caesar contrived the whole thing so that Caesar can openly in public reject it. We don't know. Caesar, finding that the experiment had proved a failure, so Plutarch suggesting that perhaps Caesar had hoped that it would be accepted, not that it was a gambit in order to openly reject it, but that he wanted it and the whole thing just went sour on him in the moment. That's what Plutarch's suggesting here. Caesar, finding that the experiment had proved a failure, rose from his seat and ordered the wreath to be carried to the capital. It was then discovered that his statues had been decorated with royal diadems, and two of the tribunes, Flavius and Marullus, went round the statues and tore down the decorations. They then found out who had been the first to salute Caesar as king and led them off to prison. The people followed the tribunes and were loud in their applause, calling them Brutuses, because it was Brutus who first put an end to the line of kings in Rome and gave to the Senate and the people the power that had previously been in the hands of one man. That's an ancient Brutus going back to sort of the 5th century BC, hundreds of years before this. The original Brutus. This made Caesar angry. He deprived Marullus and Flavius of their tribuneship, and in speaking against them, he insulted the people at the same time, frequently referring to them as brutes and Cimmerians. It was in these circumstances that people began to turn their thoughts towards Marcus Brutus, that is, a descendant of the original Brutus I mentioned, who did away with the kings of Rome centuries before. His family line is still going. There's, over the centuries, many, many Brutuses. And there's one alive during this time, an adult man alive at this time, also called Brutus. And there was a rumour that perhaps even this Brutus was the illegitimate, unacknowledged son of Julius Caesar. We don't know that for sure one way or the other, but it's an interesting rumour. Plutarch says, he was thought to be, this contemporary Brutus, he was thought to be, on his father's side, a descendant of Brutus who had abolished the monarchy, and on his mother's side he came from another famous family, the Servilii, and he was a son-in-law and a nephew of Cato. But his own zeal for destroying the new monarchy was blunted by the honours and favours which he had received from Caesar. It was not only that at Pharsalus, after Pompey's flight, his own life had been spared, and the lives of many of his friends at his request, but he was also a person in whom Caesar had particular trust. He had been given the most important of the praetorships for this very year, and was to be consul 3 years later. For this post he had been preferred to Cassius, who had been the rival candidate. Caesar, indeed, is said to have admitted that Cassius had the better claim of the two for the office. But, he added, I cannot pass over Brutus. And once, when the conspiracy was already formed, and some people were actually accusing Brutus to Caesar of being involved in it, Caesar laid his hands on his body and said to the accusers, Brutus will wait for this skin of mine, implying that Brutus certainly had the qualities which would entitle him to power, but that he would not, for the sake of power, behave basely and ungratefully. However, those who were eager for the change, and who looked to Brutus as the only, or at least the most likely, man to bring it about, used, without venturing to approach him personally, to come by night and leave papers all over the platform and the chair where he sat to do his work as praetor. Most of these messages were of this kind: you are asleep, Brutus, or you are no real Brutus, i.e. a regicide. You don't deserve the name Brutus. The old Brutus, the original Brutus, did away with kings and autocrats, and you're not worthy of the name. Where's the old Brutus now? Sort of a thing. And when Cassius observed that these messages were having at least something of an effect on Brutus's personal pride, he redoubled his own efforts to incite him further. Cassius, as I have mentioned in my Life of Brutus, had reasons for his own for hating Caesar. Moreover, Caesar was suspicious of him, and once said to his friends, What do you think Cassius is aiming at? Personally, I am not too fond of him. He is much too pale. And on another occasion, it is said that when Antony and Dolabella were accused to him of plotting a revolution, Caesar said, "I'm not very much afraid of these fat, long-haired people. It's the other type I'm more afraid of, the pale, thin ones," by which he meant Brutus and Cassius. End quote. Okay, so before we start on the details, the real details of Caesar's assassination and the plots, various plots against him, I do want to say a few more words about the period of Caesar ruling. He introduced all sorts of reforms that were kind of desperately needed. If the Senate, the senatorial class, the optimates, had done these things generations before, perhaps all the civil wars could have been avoided. Caesar, because he's an autocrat now and can essentially do as he pleases, brings in all sorts of reforms about land and taxes and the very way politics was done. And they weren't designed to just simply increase his prestige and power. They were things that the state needed. They were things that were absolutely essential if the Republic, in whatever form, were to survive. If many of these reforms had been done during the age of the Gracchi, or if Marius or Sulla had done these things, there may well have never been a Caesarian, Pompeian civil war. Caesar was looking to, I firmly believe, although there was an argument to be made to the contrary, Caesar was trying to keep the Republic going, right? He was holding on to that bicycle seat without stabilizers. He wasn't looking just to mangle the bike entirely, throw the kid off the bike and throw the bike in a crusher. He wasn't doing that, right? He wanted to try and keep the whole thing going. I think that's fair to say. I don't think there's a great deal of evidence to suggest he wanted to make it just a full-blown, completely overt monarchy, the way Diocletian does. A few centuries from now, there's an emperor, Diocletian, and he very deliberately, very overtly solidifies the monarchy and makes the person of the emperor a majestic figure. Right? Caesar's not doing that. At most, I think you can argue that he's flirting with that idea, playing around the edges of that idea, but not diving headfirst into it. Okay, I'll let Plutarch.
If you would like to see the full version of this premium video, please head over to lotuseaters.com and subscribe to gain full access to all of our premium content.